So, guys, wherever you're listening, however you're listening, welcome to Tap, also known as the Alphabet Podcast, with me, your host, Leanna Divine. So, guys, how you all feeling? It's been a while. I appreciate it's been a while since I uploaded my last podcast. It's important to take time out to have self-care, all work and no play. But I'm back, and I'm back with a subject that's very, very, very important to me in my Alphabet podcast. It was one of the ones that I'd outlined initially, so some things have deviated, but I've always wanted to do a segment on domestic abuse. So today, guys, we're going to be taking a deeper look at domestic abuse. On another note, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and I said it with Black History Month. Anything that raises awareness about things is good. It's good to raise awareness about domestic violence. And I think the theme this year for 2023 was heal, hold, and center. So I think the healing aspect was to do with the many cultural ways that we can heal survivors of domestic violence. The holding was to do with how we hold space for survivors. So taking a better look at how we support others that are going through domestic abuse or violence, and maybe for ourselves. But the third part, centering, is taking a look at those most marginalized, because as we know, with those that are very marginalized, we often don't hear the stories. So today I want to talk about domestic abuse, guys. And what I will say at the beginning, and I hope that I will illustrate it throughout the podcast, and I'll keep coming back to it. Domestic abuse is not just violence. So I want you guys to let that sink in for a minute. Domestic abuse is not just violence, but it's something that's very, very, very important, and it's going on, and it's not spoken about nearly enough. I think there's still a lot of shame and stigma, and not a lot of understanding around what constitutes abuse. So today I want to try to delve into that a bit more. So before we start, I just want to throw out two really alarming stats that I came across while I was doing the research for this podcast, because as always, I do some research. I mean, I didn't do much on my freestyle, but usually there's a lot of research that goes into any subject that I put out there. So the first one that really struck me was every 30 seconds, the police are called in the UK for an incident relating to domestic abuse. So that's every 30 seconds. So I've been speaking now for maybe a minute and a half. So that's 3 calls in regards to domestic abuse. Now, this stat is even more astounding, and it's maybe one that you've heard. I know years ago, it used to be on average 1 woman a week would be murdered by her partner or ex-partner, but now that's increased, and it's on average 2 women a week are murdered by a partner or an ex-partner. The time when you split up tends to be the most dangerous time for that type of femicide. But today I want to take a look at domestic abuse. So I want to look at what is domestic abuse, because I think everyone, or most people, should I say, have an idea of what domestic violence is. It's a lot easier to spot, maybe, in terms of seeing bruises or seeing certain behaviors. But what is domestic abuse? How common is domestic abuse? Because, like I say, it's something that people know about, but it's not spoken about nearly enough. And I think there are a lot of stigmas around that. What are the signs of domestic abuse? Because, like I've already alluded to, domestic abuse is not just violence. So if there are no bruises, how do we know that abuse is going on? What is the impact of domestic abuse? Now, this is very important. It's obviously a mental health podcast. I like to add in other aspects, but primarily it's a mental health podcast. So what are the mental health impacts of domestic abuse? We also need to look at, because we're trying to provide solutions, what are the barriers to firstly recognizing domestic abuse, and secondly, seeking the help to leave a domestic abuse situation and to recover from a domestic abuse situation. So alongside anything that's not really spoken about, there's going to be stigmas also. So what are the stigmas and maybe some of the misconceptions around domestic abuse? And because I like to look at solutions, because we can sit here all day and look at the problems, but we want to ideally try to come up with some self-help solutions and how we can support each other in our relationships. So what can we do if we're experiencing domestic abuse, or we think that's one of our loved ones or friends may be experiencing domestic abuse? And finally, I want to add somewhere in this podcast my own experience of domestic abuse. To those that know me, that might even be a surprise that I would even be saying that I've experienced domestic abuse, because I'd probably come across as quite an assertive individual. And I feel like I was raised that if anybody put hands on me, like my mum told me, if anybody hits you, hit them back. And not just my mum, but the other adults around me. And for the most part, I know what to do if someone hits me. I either choose to hit them back or I don't. There's other types of abuse that are a lot more subtle. So maybe delving into my own experiences may help someone identify patterns of abuse in their own relationship. So the first thing I really want to get into is, guys, what is domestic abuse? So I'm going to go with a definition by Women's Aid, who help and support victims, female victims of domestic abuse and violence. And they've highlighted the definition of domestic abuse to be an incident or repeated incidents of controlling, coercive, threatening, degrading, and violent behavior, which includes sexual violence. In the majority of cases, is perpetrated by a partner or an ex-partner, but it can also be a family member or carer. Now, that's very important because a lot of the things around domestic abuse tend to be a domestic violence and just between a male and a female partner. It is very common, domestic abuse, and in the vast majority of cases, it is experienced by women and perpetrated by men. So that's the definition by Women's Aid. For the most part, I agree with that, but I do think that in order for abuse to occur, you only need a manipulator and a victim. So I feel like there are a lot more male victims, but we'll get into that maybe later on. So what is domestic abuse? Let's look at some types of domestic abuse. And I think the first most identifiable type of domestic abuse that people recognize is domestic violence. So the physical aspects. So like I said, that would be violence like slapping, punching, choking, kicking, and even as far as using weapons. 19% of recorded domestic abuse offences or violence offences involve a weapon. So that's quite scary. And we've already said that 2 women a week are murdered by a partner or an ex-partner. So there is a big element around physical violence, but with physical violence, it's not always visible. People think you'd be able to see the black eyes, maybe potentially, but people are always sometimes can be smart about these things and maybe hit to the body. We've got the slapping, the punching, the choking, but we've also got things like pinching, biting, anything that causes you physical harm. Then we have sexual abuse, which is also comes under the umbrella of domestic abuse. And that does not just involve being pressured or forced to have sex, being held down, what people often think about when they think about sexual abuse or rape, but also without your consent, because sex needs to be consensual. It's 2023. We need to look again at how we deal with consent. We need to speak to our sons. We need to speak to our daughters. But sexual abuse can involve any kind of unwanted attention that involving groping, any kind of unwanted sexual activity will come under the umbrella of sexual abuse. So there's that aspect. Then we have the psychological or emotional abuse, which for people that are experiencing it is a lot harder to identify. And when I speak later about my own story, people often don't start with the physical violence. There's obviously, or normally, or usually some type of other abuse going on alongside the physical abuse. People have to break you down to get you to the point where you would accept being physically harmed. So we're looking at things like gaslighting, belittling, insulting, harsh language, and being exposed to traumatic things that disrupt your psyche. So it's psychological and emotional. So obviously there's a lot more things that come under that, but we're just touching on some of the things right now. So financial or economic. And I feel like financial abuse is becoming more and more into people's awareness, but excuse me, that just involves the mistreatment of someone in terms of their money, assets, property. And this also usually occurs alongside other abuse. So we are looking at potentially carers, family members, anyone that's trusted by someone who maybe not have full capacity or is not able to manage their finances. Then we have the harassment and stalking. Now, anybody that's been watching EastEnders recently and followed Stacey's story can see some of the barriers involved in harassment and stalking. There's very limited powers that the police have to enforce it. I mean, it's a lot better than it was 20 years ago, but that still needs looking at. Then we have online and digital abuse, which does occur. It's 2023. People don't have to leave the house now to abuse you. They may be tracking you, things like that, abusing you online, putting things out about you that's not true in order to turn people against you. And then we have a big one, which is coercive control. Now, I've heard a lot of that about, and I feel like people to the most part understand that coercive control is not just violence, but I don't know if they understand all the things that come along with it. So we will look at that in a little while. But from 2015, Section 76 of the Serious Crime Act made coercive control a criminal offence that's punishable by a maximum sentence of 5 years. So slowly, the justice system is catching up with the other types of abuse that occur. So we have things like FGM that's not really spoken about, that still exist in certain cultures, and honor-based abuse, which again is very close-knit and is not spoken about. It may happen in Asian communities, but some African communities and other communities around the world. We will take a deeper look at coercive control a bit later, but how common is domestic abuse? Because I see some stats and I think, wow, that's really common. But I do think because people often don't report it, how more common is it? So 1 in 5 adults in their lifetime will experience domestic abuse. Okay, so 1 in 5. So that's male, female, non-binary. But let's break it down a little bit more, because I feel like sometimes, like I've said before, the stats don't always tell the full story. So 1 in 4 women in their lifetime will experience domestic abuse of some kind. And we've already outlined that it's not just violence, but also 1 in 6 to 7 men. And I feel like, especially amongst men, there's definitely shame amongst women, but definitely amongst men, I feel like a lot of men wouldn't talk about it, wouldn't report it, and nobody would ever know about it. So looking at that 1 in 6 to 7 men, I'm thinking that could possibly be a lot more. And I've already alluded to at the beginning that the police receive a domestic abuse related call every 30 seconds. I mean, that's wild. Every 30 seconds. And that's of those that's being reported. And I've said 2 women a week are murdered by a partner or an ex-partner. But what's not spoken about really, because I feel like that's a stat that I've heard and people are always open-mouthed about it. But what's not spoken about is that 3 women a week die by suicide as a result of domestic abuse. So can you imagine being in a situation that's so untenable that the only way out you feel is to take your own life? So this really needs speaking about. And women, for the most part, are the ones that are the victims. But I really do need to emphasize again that in order for abuse to occur, you just need a manipulator and a victim. So women also perpetrate abuse. But for the most part, women are the victims. You might be shocked to know that domestic abuse often gets worse during pregnancy. So you can imagine a vulnerable time where hormones are all over the place, already feeling very sensitive. They're being abused during pregnancy. And that's backed up by 20% of the women that are in refuges are either pregnant or have recently given birth. Now, parents, I want you to listen up. So if you're a male parent, female parent, and you have female children, 41% of girls in the UK aged between 14 to 17 say that they have experienced some form of sexual violence in an intimate relationship. Are your daughters coming back and telling you what's going on in their relationships? Potentially, maybe with boys their own age or maybe slightly older boys, but 41% that we know about. That's nearly half of teenage girls between 14 and 17 that are experiencing that in their relationships. So once again, we're often highlighting potentially maybe if someone's beating you, what you can do and how to speak up. But are we telling our young people about other types of abuse? The stat that's been long astounding me, it takes an average of 7 attempts before a woman is able to leave an abusive partner. So there's a lot of manipulation that goes into it, going back and forth, a lot of kids. But something that I really want to talk about, and I want to talk about it because it's something, I'm a part of the community of women. I'm a woman. I'm a community of Black women because I'm a Black woman. But I'm also in the LGBT community, which is a community that I'm also a part of. So when I speak about being intersectional, I am intersectional. So 25% of LGBT people suffer through violent or threatening relationships with partners and ex-partners. So that is about the same as it is for heterosexual women. And that's what we know about, because there are issues around LGBT people reporting violent crimes in general. So I would expect that to be a lot higher. And I've seen other stats that say that actually in same-sex relationships, the rates of domestic violence and abuse are higher. And I've had a look at that because having experienced domestic abuse at the hands of a female partner, I might add, I've looked into what goes into this, because it's important to understand, because it's something that's not really spoken about. The LGBT community often get left out of the discussion. But I looked at things like the projection and introjection of self-hate. So I know for myself, I've had to deal with a lot of internalized homophobia. So I'm not in the closet, I'm openly gay. I've been socialized in a heteronormative way. So sometimes that creates a conflict within myself. And there were periods of my life where I did have elements of self-hate. Now, if you have two people in a relationship where one's projecting that self-hate and one's introjecting that self-hate, you can see where there could be a cycle of abuse there. There's also other explanations like the minority stress model, which says that sexual minorities, just by being a sexual minority, are exposed to more stress. But that all feels a little bit too simplistic. So I've looked at things like the double closet phenomenon, which even some of my gay friends have not really heard about, and definitely not many of my straight friends. So it's the idea of gay people or LGBT people having to come out, maybe to friends and relatives, and then being victims of abuse, having to then come out again to deal with the authorities and have that whole judgment placed on them once again. So there is that. And I also wonder if in same-sex relationships in particular, it's even being recognized as abuse, because it's often portrayed as domestic violence in particular as something that happens between a man and a woman, with the male being the perpetrator and the female the victim. So are you even recognizing that? Because I know in my relationship where I was a victim of domestic abuse, I don't think for a long period of time I realized I was being abused. It's not until the physical abuse started that I was able to then say, okay, this is what this is, and then look a bit closer at the other aspects. Because like I say, people don't start off by abusing you. I'm looking at toxic masculinity within the LGBT community. So a lot of the heteronormative, toxic, masculine ideas of asserting control, power, and dominance. I wonder if that comes through, because there is a lot of labeling, putting lesbians into different categories, stud, femme, all of that stuff, STEM, all of these different things. And I wonder if some of that toxic masculinity is often interjected, and those ideals of power and asserting control and dominance coming through in that, because it's something that's happening. And people may be ashamed. They've already had to come out and they fear judgment, and then having to tell family members that actually this partner that I've fought to come out for is now abusing me. Hopefully I can have more discussions around that, but I will often circle back to issues that affect all aspects of the communities that I'm from. So 20% of children, that's 1 in 5 children, have lived with an adult perpetrator of abuse. So we know from looking at attachment and looking at depression and the backpacks that these are the things that go into children's backpacks and affect them later down the line. So domestic abuse is linked to depression and homelessness. So women in particular who experienced domestic abuse are twice as likely to experience depression as someone who's not experiencing domestic abuse. But also 40% of homeless women state domestic abuse as a contributing factor to their homelessness. Relating back to my own experiences, I know that becoming homeless was one of the effects of the domestic abuse and the isolation from my family. So let's just go straight ahead and look at the signs of domestic abuse. So we'll start with the physical. So people often recognize violence, potentially black eyes, bruises, sprained wrists where maybe they're potentially trying to defend themselves, wearing sunglasses inside, heavy makeup to conceal the bruises, maybe flinching when you go to touch them, or maybe flinching because they have an injury somewhere concealed on their body. But it's not an exhaustive list. There are so many other things to look out for, but I can't list them all. I would be here all day, but it's just taking a closer look at your loved ones and what's going on for them when you're checking in as well. So things like agitation and anxiety, or maybe potentially your loved one being extremely apologetic. You might even recognize this in yourself, guys. Low self-esteem. There has to be an element of low self-esteem with abuse. So maybe you may have been someone who felt like you had high self-esteem at the start, but this perpetrator has bit by bit broke down your defenses and your self-esteem, and now you're suffering from low self-esteem, and you're recognizing that this is not something that's ever happened before. So appearing fearful. Okay, that's another one, just appearing scared of everything, all of a sudden being quite scared of the world that we live in. Withdrawing from friends and family. Now, this is a big one with all mental health and physical health problems and violence and abuse. There will be a certain amount of withdrawing from friends and family. Now, for the abuser, this is perfect because you now have this person isolated, and you can then introduce a cycle of abuse to them because there's no one around. So most people that are starved of attention will take any attention, even if it's from an abuser. So that's a very big one. So if you notice that your friends and family members have been withdrawn, take a deeper look into that. So drugs and alcohol to cope. So it may be that you're recognizing this in yourself. You're having to drink more excessively to enjoy your relationship, or you're a family member or friend outside seeing that in a person. Some examples, because sometimes it's hard to know like this. So if you're someone that think that maybe you've been listening to this now and you're listening a bit closer and thinking maybe you may be a victim of domestic abuse, listen a bit closer. Does your partner accuse you of having affairs with no evidence or anything, no reason to believe? Do they blame you for the abuse? This often happens with gaslighting, or they will deny it altogether. The next point would be denying that the abuse happened. So this happens a lot of time with abusers. They have their narrative, and part of it, of breaking down your mind, is to make you second guess whether you're being abused. Belittling or putting you down. Are you having to ask permission to go to places? Not to upset your partner, potentially feeling like you're walking on eggshells, because that's a big one with abuse. I remember when I'm recalling my experiences, I spent most of my time walking on eggshells, trying not to upset my partner and bring on that cycle of abuse. Coercive control, I spoke about it a bit earlier, it being a crime now since the Serious Crime Act, but people need to understand now that it's a crime. And it often involves things like isolating the individual from their friends, depriving them of basic needs, taking control of everyday aspects of their life, when you can go to school, when you can go to college, when you can go to work, what you can wear, who you see, when you sleep, telling you things like you're worthless and maybe nobody else would want you. Part of breaking down your psyche. Enforcing rules that humiliate you. That's a big one. And back to economic abuse again, and financial abuse, getting people into coerced debt, them not having a say in it, using their details to take out loans, etc. Threats to hurt or kill. So it could be that them threats involve hurting themselves. In fact, sometimes a lot of abusers will say, if you don't stay with me, I'll kill myself. Threats to hurt your children. Monitoring a person online in 2023 with all of this cyber stuff. Guys, like I said at the beginning, domestic abuse is not just violence. It really isn't. It involves so many other things that people are not recognizing as abuse. So deep that for a bit. But how are you guys coping with the change in weather and it feeling quite dark? Yeah, it's not great. But we have to really invest in self-care when it's times like this and the world is feeling quite negative. But for me, the mental health aspect is what I look at, and the impact that it has on people's life, domestic abuse, because it's not something that just happens. And then if you're fortunate enough to get out of that situation, the repercussions can last for years and years and have so much impact on people. So I think the first impact that domestic abuse has is on the family unit. A household with loads of conflict and violence is not really a safe place to live. And if you're raising children, we're looking at things like attachments. We're looking at potentially giving your children disorganized attachments. Their safe haven, their place of safety being a place that's not safe. But the impact of domestic abuse on a long-term basis is that you expect to see more common mental health problems. So we've already said that women that experience domestic abuse are twice as likely to have depression. But looking at things like anxiety, PTSD, one of the main symptoms of PTSD is anxiety, but also having to deal with potentially flashbacks. and the knock-on effect on your new relationships. I would expect to see some trust issues and trouble forming relationships, potentially not feeling safe. And also that word, the repetition compulsion again, that which we don't resolve, we seek to recreate. So if you've grown up seeing your parents, one of your parents being abused, or potentially one of your parents was a narcissist, you may seek out narcissistic partners, and you may also seek out abusive partners. But equally, you may be abused, but you equally may be an abuser. So being exposed to things like this causes all kinds of problems, and it has an impact on future generations. So I've already mentioned the isolation. So long after potentially a domestic abuse relationship has ended, you often hear people saying that they're still isolated because they lost friends. Their family members turned their back on them. So there's a big knock-on effect. And another thing, I've always wanted to talk about eating disorders on this podcast. If I ever get back to E, that's definitely a good shout, because 30% of people, so that's male and female, who experience sexual abuse develop eating disorders. So there is a very, very, very strong link between abuse and eating disorders. Now, the next thing that we need to think about is the physical impact of domestic abuse. The body keeps the score. So if you've gone through a lot of trauma and you're constantly going through a state of high anxiety and you're suffering from PTSD, it can manifest in your body. But the big thing for me, I work with a lot of young people, is the impact on young people's mental health. And I don't know if I have not so far introduced the concept of ACEs, and that's adverse childhood experiences, to the podcast, because that really needs its own podcast, and it may be more than one. That's looking at childhood trauma, but it's just looking at the experiences that children go through that can affect their development and their lives later on. So when we're talking about ACEs, there's 10 main ACEs. There are more. Things like racism have to be added in, potentially Black children suffering from more ACEs just by being Black children. But there are 10 main ones, but it doesn't mean there aren't more. Okay. So they can be broken down into categories. So in the abuse category, we're looking at things like physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. So I think most people would understand that would have an effect on young people going forward, and it will go into the backpack. But then there's things like neglect, physical and emotional. So neglect can be physical or emotional. So it could be that all your physical needs are being met, your parents ignore you, or they don't have a lot of time for you. And that affects attachment, as we've already said. So neglect is not just physical, it can be emotional as well. And I kind of feel that the emotional neglect has a more profound effect on a person's psyche. And then we look at the household dysfunction. We've got things like mental illness. And I've already said that a parent with a mental illness, or adults with mental illness, children are more likely to develop mental illness and learn behavior. Domestic abuse, big one, is there. Domestic abuse is an ACE. So when we're looking at domestic abuse in the household, we got to look at how it's affecting children. Okay, divorce and separation is a big one. Incarcerated adults. This may be for a young child the first time they've experienced loss. So before they know about loss through death, loss through being incarcerated, and how that affects the whole family unit. And then substance abuse. So those are the 10 main ACEs. Okay, but what people don't understand so much is that there's a big impact of ACEs. So it's not just children that it affects. You know, you could be a child that suffered from these things, and now into adulthood, you have a range of problems like managing your emotions. So not everybody that has ACEs goes on to have difficulties in their life, but 1 in 6 adults have 4 or more ACEs. And that's quite disturbing, because just having one ACE can increase your risk of mental illness and physical illness in the future. Okay. So 5 out of 10 leading causes of death, so things like cancer and heart disease, are associated with being a victim of violence. Okay. So 5 out of 10 of the leading causes of death. So things that kill you. So ACEs are not just affecting your mental health, it's killing people. Now, ACEs are also important in mental health. So 44% of adults, it could be reduced by 44% depression if we can prevent ACEs or even minimize those. The rates of depression could be reduced by 44%. Okay. So 1 in 3 Diagnosed mental health conditions can be directly related back to adverse childhood experiences. So we've had a look at those, the 10 main ones, but there are more. And the longer a child experiences an ACE and the more ACEs, the bigger impact it will have on their health and development. So if that's not a reason to leave an abusive situation, I don't know what would be, because adults often get caught up in their own world and thinking about what's best for them. But we do have to think about what's best for children, because children don't have their own voice and their voices need to be heard. I'm hoping that's putting a different look. But imagine just having more chance of dying sooner just because of the experiences that your parents put you through or the people that raised you put you through. I think that's absolutely shocking. When I did the ACEs list myself, I probably had about 20 ACEs. And that I found that quite sad. But there are some knock-on effects for your future, but it doesn't have to define you. So now we're going to move on to barriers. And I think a glaring barrier for me is just recognizing that we're being abused. Like I say, if you're being hit, you can recognize that a lot easier than if you're being constantly chipped away at, day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, constantly criticized, that walking on eggshells. But it's also in, like I say, same-sex relationships. It's recognizing that it's not just something that only happens to heterosexual women. Men are being abused, male on male abuse, female on female abuse, female on male abuse, parent on child, child on parent, sibling on sibling. It's abuse everywhere. Then I think things like cognitive dissonance, and I've spoke about that, and the easiest way to break down these big terms is the shit we tell ourselves in order to put up with the shit that we put up with. We're not fully accepting that this is what's happening because it's too difficult. So just making up your own narrative. But a big one, and I feel like I need to do this justice. A lot of my friends, they speak about trauma bonds, and you hear it on as a buzzword, trauma bonds. But really and truly, what is a trauma bond? Because it's very important. So the first thing I'll say about a trauma bond is not real love, okay? A trauma bond is a psychological response to abuse, okay? So it's a psychological response to abuse. So that means that the abused person is forming a connection, a bond, having a relationship with the person who abuses them, and using things like rationalization, okay, making excuses for the abuser, feeling sympathy for the abuser. He had a hard life. She had a hard life. He doesn't mean it. It's my fault. Making excuses, having sympathy for your abuser. A bit like Stockholm syndrome, where you fall for your kidnapper, but it's not real love. But it's very, very hard to disentangle because it's often reinforced by the cycle of abuse. And the cycle of abuse involves 7 distinct parts. And you hear a lot of this with narcissistic personality disorders if your partner has this, but the first stage will be the love bombing. Now, that's something I can now recognize. My last situationship before I was in the relationship that I'm in now with my very lovely partner that was the first red flag for me. It was all the love bombing. Constantly, I love you, pretending to be this perfect person, painting this ideal picture of the future. And then comes the trust and dependency stage. You start telling the person things and you learn to trust them, depend on them. They make you feel like they're dependable. But very soon after that comes the criticism. I can't say that word too well. Constantly being criticized and belittled. So we're starting to see how the different forms of abuse are meshing together. Then comes the manipulation and gaslighting. And for those of you that don't know what gaslighting is, that is when someone tries to convince you that the abuse that's happening is not happening. So, it's all in your head, or you're being dramatic, or that never happened. So making you actually believe and doubt yourself. Okay, so that's when the manipulation and gaslighting can start. And by this point, maybe friends and family, you've become withdrawn from them, or you've pushed them away so that they're not there to help you. So then there's the resignation and giving up. I'm never going to get out of this situation. Maybe this is what I deserve, and staying there. And then comes the loss of self, the low self-esteem. See, all of the things that come with being with a narcissist or an abuser. And then the final stage 7 is the addiction to the cycle. The cycle will start all over again. So say if you manage to get to the point where you felt had enough strength to leave, maybe that narcissistic partner or with them narcissistic traits is trying to draw you back in with the love bombing again. and convincing you all over again that you can trust them and depend on them. But very shortly afterwards will come the criticism again, the manipulation and gaslighting. You will give up, you will lose yourself, and then back again, same cycle. So it's very difficult to break down. Another thing that's a barrier is shame. So, people often feel shamed on being abused. Women feel shame to tell people they're being abused, but equally, I feel like men, that stigma would be more. There'll be more shame around that. And then things like religion can be a barrier to seeking help. You may even try to seek help and reminded that your religion doesn't permit you to divorce, or you feel compelled not to break down the family unit, and being believed. So 93% of the defendants in domestic abuse cases in this country are male. Okay, so that paints a picture that it's mainly men that are the abusers. 84% of victims are female, so that seems to paint also back up the picture that men are the perpetrators, women are the victims. Yet women are 3 times more likely to be arrested for incidents of abuse. So, like I said before, domestic abuse just needs a manipulator and a victim. So if a man is feeling shameful, maybe he may call the police to stop this female partner from abusing him, or this male partner, but maybe not want to go through with it because it's shameful. Because 3 times more women are being arrested and men are being abused, but it's just not spoken about. Even amongst men, I feel like there's a lot of shame to tell other men. I don't think they'll be believed. Oh, you can't be being abused. You're a man. What's going on? But remember, a lot of things happen before the physical violence starts. You break down a person mentally, physical is not a problem. It's easy to dismantle them. But toxic masculinity is a big, big, big barrier. It's a big barrier in domestic abuse, and it's a big barrier in society. I've spoken about misogyny, the misogynoir, but toxic masculinity in general. Men with this attitude of toxic masculinity are actually a threat to women. And it's sad for me to say that because I have a brother, I have a nephew, and I don't like to look at them as potentially being threats to women. But all of these stats seem to back up that this toxic masculinity, where these traits of asserting dominance and power and normalizing violent and aggressive behaviors, is not the cause of assault, all of them, but it's definitely a contributing and underlying factor in most instances. And I don't think there's anybody that's going to convince me otherwise. And if you do want to, you need to come on and convince me and put forward a good argument. Men are being abused, don't get it twisted. And men need to talk about it in safe spaces and be believed. And I do believe men when they say they're being abused, because women can be abusers. I've been abused by a woman. So let's look at some of the stigmas and misconceptions. So domestic abuse is just violence. I'm going to keep saying it. It's not. We know that now. And you forever will know it, guys. Domestic abuse is not just violence. We now know that it's not just men against women. 25% of LGBT people experiencing domestic abuse. Women are also perpetrators against men. Okay. The shame of being believed is big, but another common myth and misconception is that it's just between partners. It's not just between partners and ex-partners. It could be between any family members, siblings, niece and nephew, parent and child, child and parent. We're seeing a lot more of that. Parents being abused by their children. But equally, there's still parents out there that are abusing their children. So there's loads of different ways. And I think misunderstanding of the language around abuse, people not fully understanding what gaslighting is and what it entails, and not understanding what trauma bonding is. So people actually in relationships, they feel like they're in love, but if they knew what trauma bonding was, they'd be much more open to potentially changing. So what can we do? Actually, before I even talk about what we can do, I might talk about my own experience, to be honest with you guys. So we've spoken about the 7 stages of abuse and the love bombing, all of that stuff, how it goes through trust and dependency, and then the criticism, then the gaslighting. And I do feel like my mum did raise me to be aware, don't ever let a man abuse you and all the rest of it. But obviously, I took a different path in life. I don't have relationships with men. I have relationships with women. And I think for me, when I first got with this partner, everything was fine. There was a lot of love bombing, which I now can, looking back, can recognize. And it seemed like it was my forever and ever. But I was very trusting, maybe naively, I was very trusting. And I used to tell my partner things about my past and stuff like that. And it was all roses and sweet for maybe the first 6 months. We were together for 5 years. And then I noticed subtle little changes, and it would just be little things just putting me down. Oh, you think you're too smart, or oh, you think you're funny, or you think you're pretty, but you're not, or you think you're this and you're not. It was just little things. And, I kind of made excuses for it, sometimes challenged it back. But looking back, I can see that it was there. And then it would be like further along down the line, I don't really like the look of that friend. That friend doesn't like me, or I think they're jealous of you. And just that constantly trying to separate your relationships. And as time went on, it became more and more. And I did feel like I was potentially not really being myself, walking on eggshells. But I'd only been out of the closet for a couple of years, and I was still dealing with my own shame and self-hate around being gay, because all of the stuff you hear growing up, it does affect your psyche. So I do feel like, looking back now, there was, from my ex-partner, that projection of self-hate and that total interjection on my part. By the time my partner first actually punched me in the face, I had not recognized that I was being abused. I'd often make excuses for her behavior. She's just stressed out, or maybe I'm annoying her. But, being punched in the face, I could decode. I understood what that meant. You've hit me, so now I hit you back. And then not feeling like the victim, because actually you hit me and I hit you back, so I can't be a victim. But not recognizing the road it had taken to get there. And then outside people slowly seeing this conflict and this relationship, this toxic relationship. And my ex going behind my back and painting pictures to my friends of me being the abuser, when all along it was her that was the abuser. And me not even being aware that was being said about me behind my back. And certain friends, to a certain degree, believing parts of it, because I'd been so withdrawn from them that they'd seen that change, but not understood the reason why I'd withdrawn. So there was a lot of withdrawal. I lost a lot of friends. My family got involved. And by that point, I'd been brainwashed into believing that your family don't really care about you. It's just me and you. If you don't got me, you haven't got anybody. And because I'd become so withdrawn, my ex was the only person there. So I could recognize that if there was physical violence, I could hit back. So I'm not a victim. I'm withdrawn from my friends and my family now. And I feel like I can't escape this. So even when the physical violence, I wasn't even thinking about potentially calling the police. Well, I've got to explain to the police that not only am I being abused, but I'm being abused by a woman. Isn't this something that happens between men and women? So not really recognizing that and still having that shame around it. And it manifested in my ex harassing and stalking me, calling up my workplace, so making my position at work untenable, coming round to my house and doing damage and trying to run me over, and abusing my family. It was just continuous and continuous and continuous. I ended up being so angry. I had issues with the criminal justice system myself, but I still don't think I recognized that I was being abused. And it's only when one day it hit me, when I looked around and I thought, I've literally lost everything. So looking back at them stats, at 40% of homeless women saying that domestic abuse was a big contributing factor in them becoming homeless. Things got so bad for me that my family wouldn't tolerate me because I wouldn't get rid of this partner. And that resulted in me having to sleep in a car for a period of time, maybe a couple of months. And even saying it now, a lot of my friends and family wouldn't even be aware that I went through that. But, it was a long time ago now, but you have the knock-on effects of that. You have the knock-on effects. So I have struggled to trust people. I think I developed some narcissistic traits myself from being in a relationship with a narcissist for so long. So having to unpick that. And sometimes I still doubt myself whether I'm enough, or just things that remain over. And I was actually explaining to my partner that I was going to speak a little bit about my own experience of domestic abuse. And she was like, no, you have to actually sit down and tell me and about what you went through. I don't want to hear about this on a podcast, Lee. The finer details are still, part of my experience. And maybe I don't want to share every part of it, but just to let you guys know that it does happen to people. And it is happening where you least expect it. Would I have expected myself to be a victim of domestic abuse? No. Domestic violence is a lot easier to recognize. The other subtle, more forms of abuse is a lot harder to untangle. So what can we do? So if there's gaslighting, so someone's making you doubt that things are happening, we can collect evidence. So you can write this down, and this is very useful, even with coercive control. Keep a diary of these events, because the person's going to deny they happened. You writing that down will give you the strength to stand firm in your beliefs and say, no, this is what happened. You can also seek validation outside. Like, I often have my friends call me up and be like, Lee, this is what's happened. And I would say at the end of the conversation, I feel like you're being gaslighted. And they would say, I felt that too, but I just wasn't sure because I'm sitting here reflecting and thinking, what did I do? You're being gaslighted. So seek validation from people that you trust, because this abuser will make you doubt everything and take away your sanity if you allow. So narcissistic boundaries, narcissists are very unlikely to respect anybody's boundaries, but they're always going to push back and be angry and try to get revenge and things like that. But sometimes it's unavoidable to deal with narcissists. So they're not always just your intimate partners. Sometimes they can be parents, because that exists, other family members that you can't get away from. So when setting boundaries with narcissists, you have to be very clear about what it is that you will and will not tolerate. What's your bottom line, your deal breaker? Do not try to avoid telling a narcissist personal information or too much personal information, and certainly challenge them about sharing that information, because narcissists have that capability. They like to share people's private things, anything that doesn't revolve around telling things about themselves. Research narcissistic personality disorder. I can't speak now. Know what it's about. Understand the game that you're playing with a narcissist and learn to play that game. You need to know what it is that they're about. If you don't know what a narcissist is and what they do, then it's more likely that you're going to fall down into a very dangerous space with them. Don't let them talk to you how they want, because they will do that. Challenge them. Don't let them talk to you how you want, especially family members. You don't have to put up with it. Ask for personal space when you need it. If they don't respect that, it's fine. Let them argue, do whatever they will try to make you feel guilty. But make sure you're comfortable with all the physical and sexual aspects of your relationship, because narcissists lack empathy. So they're not really going to care about your feelings. So you have to be very clear. What else can we do? Recognize when you're being abused. Recognize you are being abused. And that's a big one. You have to recognize this. So hopefully now some of you have listened and thought, oh, I might be being abused. But I want you to recognize that it's not your fault. It is not your fault. You are not to blame for being abused. Talk to someone you trust, especially if it includes plans to leave. And I would suggest, if you're leaving an abusive relationship, make sure that you have financial means, and be very careful who you tell, because you don't want that abuser to find you, but you need to have a way of leaving, a plan to leave. It's very difficult to just leave just like that on the spur of the moment. You have to detangle your life. So make sure you have the financial means and where you're going to go and a plan. But keep a diary. It's very good for gaslighting, but also, like I said, for coercive control. So any kind of situation where you're doubting yourself or your feelings, write it down. Work on your self-esteem, because it's likely these repeated incidents of abuse have given your self-esteem a knock. And now you're not as confident as you used to be. So finding things that kind of bring up your self-esteem, the self-care, maybe some therapy, whatever it is that you need to do to make yourself feel better about yourself. So what can we do to support our friends and loved ones if we think they might be going through domestic abuse? Because often people don't speak out, because when they do, they're judged. So we need to listen without judgment, and listen, not to respond. Okay, just listen to the person. You may have your views, and very strong views. If someone you love or care for is being abused, you're not going to be happy about it. But you really do have to take that head off. Right? Acknowledge the strength it took to talk about it, because it's not easy. This person is being systematically broken down. They are fearful. Do not push them. They're constantly being pushed and coerced, and don't push them to do anything they don't want to do. Reinforce that no one deserves to be abused, because nobody does deserve to be abused. All right? Encourage them to express their feelings. So give them a safe space. So going back to holding space for survivors, holding that space. Allow them to make their own decisions. In the relationship that they're in, they're not able to make any decisions. These decisions are being made for them by an abuser. So don't reinforce that. Allow them to make their own decisions. Do not tell them to leave if they're not ready. You just want to say, just leave. Why won't you just leave? It's not as simple as that. We've looked at the cycle of abuse and the 7 things that go into it. Ask about physical harm and offer to go with them to seek medical attention or to file a police report, whatever it is that they want. Okay, there are things that we can do. Domestic abuse is happening everywhere. It's happening in homes across the country, homes across the world. Try and make sure that you can reduce it in your home. We've seen the impact it has on children. We've seen the impact it has on mental health. We've seen the impact it has on relationships. We understand that there's loads of barriers. People are still not talking about it as much as they should because of the shame. Let's do what we can do. Take ownership of this and support our loved ones that are potentially being abused. Help them to see that they're being abused. Don't judge them and don't allow them to become isolated, because that's how an abuser wins. So today it's been a long one, guys, and it's been a lot to take in. And I really hope that nobody's triggered by anything that I've said. And if so, just you got to understand sometimes that triggers are spaces where we're not been completely set free yet. So I know that there are a lot of women and men that and non-binary people that have experienced abuse and are still not ready to talk about it. And that's okay. It's your story. Tell it if you want to. No one deserves to be abused. So I hope today's been helpful. I will be back real soon. I haven't quite decided what I'm going to do, but just to let you guys know, you can now find the podcast on Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts, because some people might like to see me twitching around in the chair. Other people might just like my voice. Me personally, I like to listen to podcasts. I don't necessarily need to see what's going on. I like to hear what's going on and maybe use my imagination. But don't wait on notifications to come. The Alphabet podcast is here. It's out there. We're outside with this now. I would like people to want to join the discussion. So I have a lot of people say, oh, I want to come on the podcast, and just put yourself out there. Talk about things that are important to you. Join the discussion. Difficult conversations around mental health need to be had. Let's start having them. But for today, guys, Lee's out, Tap's out, and I hope you guys have a great week and month ahead. See you soon.